Let's go ahead and get started. First, some introductions. If you're not familiar with Tevora, Tevora is an end-to-end cybersecurity consultancy firm. That includes all things compliance in healthcare. We mentioned here that we are an original high-trust CSF assessor. We've been doing that for almost a decade now, and we have a dedicated healthcare compliance team. We have offices on both coasts and international clients, over 1,000 clients to date, so a medium-sized consultancy. In addition to compliance, we do things like pen testing, solutions implementation, solutions consulting, among a variety of other cybersecurity offerings. As for myself, I'm the managing director of our healthcare practice. I've been doing this for 20 years, so don't hold that against me. But I do like sharing my experiences over the years with folks such as yourself to just to improve the state of security and cybersecurity all across the world. So a little bit on our agenda today. We've performed the introduction. We're going to do a brief HIPAA overview. We're going to talk a little bit about HIPAA happenings and trends, including, of course, COVID-19. We're going to talk a little bit about how to become HIPAA compliant and also talk about HIPAA risk assessments. We're going to talk a little bit about what HITRUST is and how that relates to HIPAA. And then we'll share some Tevora contact information and other upcoming webinars. So a quick timeline on HIPAA. Originally, the act was passed in 1996, but that original act was really targeting insurance portability, fraud, administrative simplification. It really didn't have any IT security elements to it. In April 14th, the privacy law was passed, and that started defining what we now think of as HIPAA. It defined PHI data, provided basic privacy requirements. And then what we really think of HIPAA now in the security world was passed April 21st of 2005. And that was the HIPAA security law. The HIPAA security rule was modified to include safeguards, administrative, technical, and physical. So you can see now it's been around for 15 years. And as a result of that, as assessors, we're forced to apply a rule that was written 15 years ago to today's IT security landscape. So just the food for thought as we go through the safeguards in the coming slides here. In 2009, high-tech and breach notification rule were passed. All breaches impacting more than 500 individuals must be reported. Another important rule is the omnibus rule, and that basically extended the security rule to business associates, not just covered entities. And we're going to get to the technical definitions here in the upcoming slide. Key HIPAA terms. So what is a covered entity? It's a health plan, a healthcare clearinghouse, or a healthcare provider. So basically, healthcare insurers or healthcare providers, hospitals, etc. That's generally what is thought of as a covered entity. Business associates, a person or entity that performs functions or activities that involve the use of PHI data on behalf of those covered entities. So if you're a hospital and you're working with any sort of IT service provider, a cloud service, that cloud service then becomes a business associate, just using that very basic and common example. It's not uncommon for a large hospital to have hundreds of business associates. So just to help put that in context. In terms of the HIPAA work that we do here at Tevora, we've got a pretty healthy mix of both covered entities and business associates across globally. We'll talk a little bit more about HIPAA trends and what we're seeing. But Tevora has a pretty broad portfolio of both covered entities and business associates. The last data point there, PHI data, protected health information. It's a really critical element of HIPAA to understand, because HIPAA security role revolves around protecting that data. PHI data identifies an individual or could be used to identify an individual, describes the healthcare condition or payments of an individual, or describes the demographics of an individual. So that's really the sensitive data that the HIPAA rule is aiming to protect. So a little bit more on what PHI is, and these are the identifiers that have been outlined by the Department of Health and Human Services that constitute what PHI data is. So you can see here, it's not just name. If you're using a vehicle serial number, for example, that can be used as an identifier for an individual. But it's important to know that these identifiers by themselves are not PHI data. They need to be associated with some of those health conditions that were previously mentioned, or a health condition or something healthcare related. So just the name, of course, is not PHI data, but a name with a doctor, then you're getting closer to PHI data, or that is PHI data, or healthcare provider. So just a little bit on what PHI data is. So who's required to comply with HIPAA? I'm not going to read this entire slide, but I did want to include the details in here for those of you that want a copy of this presentation. It's basically covered entities or business associates. So those healthcare insurers or providers and their business associates are required to comply. Now, I get the question a lot over the years, well, what if you're a business associate of a business associate? So let's take a common healthcare service provider such as Amazon AWS. The most popular cloud hosting provider in industry. Well, if you're a service provider to Amazon AWS, you are also a business associate and also required to comply with HIPAA. So this flows downstream in terms of what a business associate is. So any company that is deemed a business associate is required to comply. And to be deemed a business associate, there is no requirement that you have to work directly with the covered entity. A business associate that works with a business associate, or a company that works with a business associate, is also a business associate. So that's a question we get all the time over the years, and just wanted to point out that clarification here. So let's get to the safeguards. This is really, when that rule came out in 2005, this was the meat of it. This was what do we actually need to do to secure PHI data? So here are what HIPAA calls the safeguards. And each of these safeguards are required to be implemented to be HIPAA compliant. Now, there is a key concept called addressable, and some of these requirements are deemed as addressable, which means that they're not required, which is the other designation. But at a minimum, you need to have strong mitigating controls, or you need to appropriately address the risk if you don't address the safeguard, or have controls that are implemented to address the safeguard. However, I didn't want to go through the exercise of this is required versus this is addressable. So I just listed them all here. We always advise our clients to assume that they're all required, because going down the path of having an addressable requirement, and you're putting in mitigating controls, but they might not completely mitigate the risk, you're opening your organization up to liability. So we always advise our clients, implement all of these safeguards. Most of them are relatively easy to implement for organizations. There are some that are tougher. For example, encryption at rest. It's difficult in a lot of platforms to do that for a variety of technical reasons. But for the most part, these safeguards can be implemented for most organizations. Some of the most common safeguards here, where there are gaps when we perform gap assessments for organizations new to HIPAA, it's not really the technical control. So things like antivirus are usually in place, login monitoring, password strength, password management, termination procedure, all of these typical types of IT security processes, those are in place. That's not where the gaps are typically. Where we most often find gaps are the non-technical areas. So when we think about, when we go down to the physical safeguards here, contingency operations, facility security planning, maintenance records, accountability is a big one. We see gaps in those physical safeguards quite a bit. When we go to the second box here, the technical safeguards, like I said, most of those are in place. Once in a while, we'll see there's a documentation clause. We'll see some gaps there. Breach notification, we may see some gaps there. But for the most part, those technical safeguards are in place. And at the top, administrative safeguards, again, there's some technical aspects to the administrative safeguards. I would say disaster recovery and emergency mode operation, app data criticality analysis. We see a lot of gaps in that. So just wanted to give kind of a 10,000-foot view of where we typically see gaps. I've done this so long, our team can basically profile a company and guess where their gaps are before we even perform the gap assessment. So there are some pretty clear consistencies across the board, depending on the type of organization and the size of your organization. But there's just a brief snapshot of all of the HIPAA security rule safeguards. We're going to go and address this from a COVID perspective in some future slides here, so stay tuned for that. Our HIPAA methodology is pretty pretty straightforward, and you'll see it. Other consultancies leverage this. We'll perform a gap assessment when clients sign up with Tevora. We go in, we understand where the gaps are, and then provide recommendations and support to address those gaps. That's that second phase, the remediation phase, where we're providing things like policies and procedures, maybe artifact examples such as a breach notification template, for example, or a business associate agreement template. Very specific requirements to HIPAA that we have templatized and that we love to share with our clients. And then the last phase there is the attestation of compliance. It's important to note that there is no such thing as a HIPAA certification. The Department of Health and Human Services goes out of its way to state that there is no HIPAA certification. So if there are any third parties out there selling HIPAA certifications, just know that there is no such thing and they're not recognized by any governmental body. But what consultancies do perform are attestations. That is, the consultancies attest to your level of HIPAA compliance. So it's a basic three-phased approach. Depending on how many gaps you have, we can get through this as quick as 3 months for your organization. Sometimes it takes longer. If you've got a complex PHI data environment with, a complex architecture, complex people and process organizations, it may take several years to become HIPAA compliant. We've certainly seen that with a lot of the larger covered entities and a lot of even some of the larger global technology service providers. So the length of the endeavor really depends on the complexity of your organization and the number of gaps that we find in that first phase, the gap assessment. Let's talk a little bit about the HIPAA risk assessment, or what is referred to in the security rule as the risk analysis. We typically have a 5-phased approach. We will perform a kickoff and planning. We'll then do some preparation. We'll conduct the risk assessment, and then we'll report on the risk assessment. And then there's some risk assessments maintenance. Those are all highlighted on this slide. A couple things in particular that I want to mention about risk assessments is that in April of 2018, the OCR, which is the Office of Civil Rights, that's the body responsible for enforcing the HIPAA security rule. They put out a memo clarifying what a risk analysis should be. And they made one pretty important distinction, which was it's not a gap assessment. A risk assessment is something very different. And the only standard that has ever been referenced by the Department of Health and Human Services and subsequently the OCR is the NIST 830 standard, which is a global, if you're not familiar with NIST 830, it's a standard that's been adopted globally, pretty widespread. And it's just a terrific standard. And it's one that Tevora leverages for its HIPAA risk assessment a standard, and it's quickly becoming the predominant standard in the healthcare world from a risk perspective. So I wanted to update those of you on that. We have a lot of clients that they may not have, they've been doing the risk assessments the old way, which is kind of more of this gap assessment approach. And when they come to us for a HIPAA risk assessment and we explain to them the new approach, they're quite surprised because they've been conducting risk assessments the old way for over a decade, and they were unaware of the memo that was put out by the DHHS. So important food for thought. If you're required to be HIPAA compliant, you're required to perform this HIPAA risk assessment, and you should follow that memo and conduct those risk assessments appropriately. That memo has a lot of good information and clarification on what a risk assessment is and isn't. Tevora, of course, performs risk assessments. It's a pretty common activity for us to perform for our clients. Once our clients become HIPAA compliant, they'll bring us in on an annual basis to perform a HIPAA risk assessment to ensure that they have an independent third party assessing their risk and hopefully reducing their liability and reducing the risk of a HIPAA breach. So a HIPAA risk assessment is a great way to achieve those two objectives. So very important, one of the most important HIPAA security rule safeguards, and I thought it was worth a slide mentioning. It comprises probably in our healthcare HIPAA work, it probably comprises about 30% of our revenue. So a pretty common service. So let's talk about what's going on in HIPAA now. We presented safeguards that were developed 15 years ago, but let's talk about what's happening now. I mentioned the risk assessment methodology update in 2018. There's also a certification out there, a healthcare security certification called HITRUST, and that started becoming predominant. I'd say around 8 years ago, we saw that start to trend in the marketplace. And recently, HITRUST adopted a HIPAA regulatory factor. That it means that you can add all of the HIPAA security rule safeguards and even the privacy rule safeguards to your HITRUST certification. Now, that does not mean that you're HIPAA certified. Again, there's no such thing as that. But there is a healthcare information security certification, and HITRUST has become that predominant certification. ISO also has healthcare-related information security certifications. If you're not familiar with the ISO standards, they're a global standard that are also globally adopted by organizations. But in North America, HITRUST has become the predominant healthcare certification to date. That's been the trend over the last 8 years. About 60% of our healthcare revenue comes from HITRUST related services. Let's talk a little medical device and healthcare technology companies. So what initially, when HIPAA came out in 2005, we, as a consultant, we were working mostly with the covered entities. That is hospitals, healthcare providers, healthcare insurers. And then some of the rules changed and business associates needed to be compliant with the security rule. We started seeing a trend. Most of the HIPAA work we were doing was predominantly with business associates after the covered entities got caught up with HIPAA. We still help covered entities to this day, but that just giving a brief history lesson on kind of how this has evolved. Nowadays, what we see is all of our new HIPAA work, medical device and healthcare technology companies, or technology companies that heavily serve the healthcare industry. We just see a lot of action in that space. And if you work for a medical device or healthcare technology company, don't be surprised if HIPAA becomes a primary objective for your organization if it hasn't already. But that's been a real big trend over the last 5 years or so, I would say. It started before that, but I would say it spiked over the last 5 years. Another trend we've seen with HIPAA is that more and more often it's being combined with other certifications or attestations. So an organization will come to the board and say, hey, we need to be PCI compliant, and we also need to be HIPAA compliant. Can you do both? Or we need to be ISO 27001 certified, and we need to be HIPAA compliant. Can you combine the two? Or it's maybe a SOC 2 attestation combined with a HIPAA attestation, or a high trust certification combined with a HIPAA attestation, whatever it may be. You're seeing more and more multiple certification attestation clients as they need to those certifications, not only to secure their environments, but to appeal to their customer base and to attest to the fact that they are compliant. So that's been a trend over the past several years that we've seen as well, that continues to be amplified. And then, of course, there have been some COVID bulletins. That's the most recent news in HIPAA. And I'm going to talk a little bit about that in the future slides here. So with COVID, we've seen a renewed interest in HIPAA because the world is changing. And the biggest change is organizations are working remotely. So organizations come to Tevora and want to know, what does this mean? What should we be thinking about? What should we be doing? And I'm going to talk a little bit about that. But that is certainly one of the outcomes of COVID. Not just healthcare companies and their employees, or hospitals and their employees working remotely, but also technology companies that are now working remotely. It's been, of course, all over the news for the last several months about this dynamic change in the workplace with more folks working at home. And a lot of analysts expect that's a trend that will remain after COVID has moved on. So that is probably one of the biggest impacts to HIPAA that I've seen over the last 20 years, in terms of something that's happened in the marketplace that's impacted an interest in HIPAA. Organizations are looking for more robust controls. They realize the HIPAA security rule and the safeguards, they were written in 2005. There's still a good basic set of safeguards, but now you look at a framework like HITRUST, and it has over 300 control requirements. It's literally 8 times larger on average than the HIPAA security rule in terms of the number of safeguards or requirements. So the world has become more complex since 2005, and that has required more nuanced and more sophisticated cybersecurities and security controls. In COVID, what organizations are coming to us for is, hey, we understand HIPAA, that might be the dialogue, but they say, what else is there out there? What else can we be thinking about? So I'm going to talk a little bit about that in a future slide here, but that's been a pretty conversation over this past couple of months. A memo came out by the DHHS on May 5th. So, and they don't put out a lot of big memos. This one was basically stating, hey, the HIPAA rule still applies. Before hospitals or healthcare providers share COVID patients' information with the media, they need authorization from that patient before they do that, or that is a HIPAA violation. So they put out a very specific memo on that. So I thought that was worth mentioning. Just because you're working with COVID does not mean that you're no longer required to be HIPAA compliant. That seems pretty commonplace, but the Department of Health and Human Services thought it prudent to issue that memo. So that is something that I thought was worth noting. Another memo that came out on March 20th, and you can see this is right around the time the pandemic was becoming publicized in North America. They issued telehealth guidance, and that message was quite the opposite of the message on May 5th, which was, hey, and I'm giving you the 10,000-foot view, but it was basically, go ahead and do telehealth, because we realize that's what's going to need to be done to provide healthcare guidance remotely to reduce the exposure to COVID, and that they would lack some of the restrictions as it relates to HIPAA for that telehealth guidance. So if that message that came out earlier, March 20th, almost contradicts the memo that came in May 5th from a theoretical perspective, but I thought that was worth mentioning. And if you're in the business of telehealth, we have over 10 telehealth clients in our client portfolio. And they've been reaching out to us quite a bit on this. But if you're a telehealth company, definitely make it a point to read that memo and understand what it means from a HIPAA compliant perspective. But the gist of it was, hey, please do the telehealth. We need to serve the population and treat COVID. We'll worry about HIPAA later. That was the general gist or takeaway. And then, of course, I mentioned remote working. So what I did was I took that same safeguard slide and I highlighted the areas that COVID, the safeguards that most directly impact the COVID world. Risk analysis. So is your company performing a risk assessment on your new environment? Okay, so you're a 500-person company, maybe you're a 50,000-person company. Now 75% or 90% of your workforce is working remotely. What does that mean from a risk perspective? And how are you managing those risks? That is analysis that needs to be performed. Security reminders. So this is basically how are you reminding the workforce now that they're working remotely, what are the security safeguards and controls that they should be aware of? And what should your employees be thinking about from a data security and privacy perspective as they're working from home? And are you, as an information security group or IT group, doing an adequate job of providing those reminders to your workforce? Security incident management. So security incidents, again, if you have an incident that may compromise PHI data, do you have a process in place for remote workers to interact with a security incident process? Someone had their laptop in their home office and they went out for a hike and someone stole their laptop and it had 10,000 PHI data records. Do they know immediately who to call? Is there a process in place for that? If you were a company that did not have remote workers with that level of PHI data at their homes, that may not have been a scenario that your older incident management policy may not have accounted for. So making sure that you have a bulletproof security incident management process certainly applies to the COVID world. Emergency mode operation. And we've seen a huge spike in business continuity and disaster recovery consultant requests over the last couple of months because we're in the middle of a crisis and to some extent a disaster. And people are working remotely and it requires a new set of DER and more so BCP or emergency mode operation processes. So we've seen a huge spike, particularly from covered entities in this space, but certainly we've seen it from business associates as well. So again, one of the HIPAA security rule safeguards that you should be thinking of in this during this time of pandemic. Technical safeguards, authentication. How are your folks remotely authenticating to your network? Is it a strong authentication? Have you considered multi-factor authentication, a VPN, utilities and tools for transmission integrity and authentication? There are some technical safeguards that should be in place. If your workforce is transitioning to a remote setup, have you considered desktop encryption for your laptops? So encryption, transmission integrity, authentication, those are some of the technical things you should think of when you're thinking of remote working or working from home. Physical safeguards, are employees using their workstations or their laptops securely at home? Are they locking those laptops and securing them when they leave them with things like cable locks? Are they using them in a crowded space where PHI data can be seen on their screen? So do they have dark screens on their computers in those instances? These are all basic security measures that may not have been considered in the past, but now that folks are remotely working, the world has changed and some of those safeguards may need to be revisited. And then of course, device media disposal, device and media reuse. With more and more folks relying on media and devices as a result of this remote working world, have you thought through your policies and procedures around those safeguards to secure those devices and the use of that media. So those, I just wanted to kind of give again, the 10,000-foot view of how COVID has impacted the safeguards, and really it can impact all of the safeguards. I highlighted the ones that we get the most questions about and that have been trending, if you will, in the HIPAA world. But certainly you should take a look at all of the safeguards, not just the ones that I've highlighted, and understand how your organization's new environment or environments are impacted. A little bit more about HITRUST. I mentioned it has over 300 requirements on average. It's a more robust framework for protecting PHI data. It's the only universally recognized healthcare information security certification. Again, that does not mean you're HIPAA certified, but it is the most universally recognized healthcare information security certification out there, certainly in North America. And I guess in Europe, you would take a look at some of the ISO offerings as being the most popular there, but those are still, I would say, in their infancy stages when compared to where HITRUST is at in North America. We do a lot of webinars, and we have a really good HITRUST webinar at Tevora.com. So find our webinar page at Tevora.com, or you can reach out directly to me to learn more about some of these other standards, such as HITRUST that I've mentioned, or ISO 27001, PCI, etc. We just a lot of really good information on our website. So please visit it and get up to speed on some of these other frameworks and security topics. A little bit more about HITRUST. Reasons why organizations seek HITRUST certification. They're a business associate or covered entity, and they're required to demonstrate that a level of security and privacy. For example, the New York Health Exchange is one of our clients. They're required by the New York Department of Health to be HITRUST certified. So there are a lot of organizations we work with that are required. A comprehensive control framework to help better secure your environment. You know, some organizations, they realize that HIPAA only 45 safeguards, so they may need something or want something more robust to ensure their security and privacy. Last place, and we see this a lot with technology companies or startups that are in the healthcare vertical. They want a differentiator to demonstrate that they're, whatever it is, whatever product or service it is that they're selling, that they're also secure, and they want that HITRUST seal of approval on it. So we've seen that quite a bit as well. So it's really a more proactive approach to getting HITRUST certified. Tevora's value proposition: we provide policy templates, procedure examples, strategic remediation. This is a huge differentiator for us. We roll up our sleeves with our clients and we help them get compliant. Because we are an end-to-end cybersecurity consultancy, we have folks that can configure your firewalls, for example, that can perform pen testing, that can act as a third-party incident response unit. You name it, Tevora is end-to-end. That puts us in a pretty rarefied air. There's only a handful of companies in the country that offer that level of end-to-end service. So that's a big deal. That really helps differentiate us, and more so than anything, help our clients become compliant and more secure, which is our end of the goal. We don't want to be just checkbox auditors at Tevora. That's our mission statement. It basically is to not be that. So we practice what we preach. We provide great executive summaries. We talk to board of directors on a weekly basis almost, and have a lot of executive relationships that we've fostered over the years, and have presence at the C-suite level all across the country and across all verticals. I mentioned we're a solution provider, so if you need a SIM, if you need you know, an advanced logging and monitoring application, maybe you need a whitelisting or blacklisting application, whatever sort of security tool you need implemented, we provide those solutions. We sell them and we provide them the consulting to get those. Okta has been one that's trended over the last couple of years. A lot of identity and access management work in the Okta space, real popular with our clients as a single sign-on, et cetera, et cetera. Customer satisfaction. Tevora has retained a very high percentage of its clients, and I think it's because of this value proposition right here. And because we value relationships, we put our heart and soul into our relationships with our clients, and the customer satisfaction speaks to that. We are not a publicly traded company. We're not trying to chase a stock price. We have no venture capital money. We are privately owned, which again puts us in rarefied air and one of the largest privately owned cybersecurity groups in the country. So that is something that I believe, and one of the reasons why I came to Tevora from larger organizations is because of that value of relationships and not just chasing the bottom line. And then of course, experience. We have a dedicated healthcare group. We're large enough where we have dedicated high trust experts, dedicated HIPAA experts, et cetera, et cetera. Experience matters. Having someone that's done HIPAA assessments for 2 years, not as good as someone that's done it for 10 years, right? The 10-year guy can tell you how HIPAA has evolved, what the different interpretations are, what he's seen at other similar companies, et cetera, et cetera. So experience matters, of course, in the HIPAA world. So that's it. That's questions. We don't have a lot of time to take questions. And I didn't really advertise that we'd be taking questions, so we don't have any. But if you do, please feel free to reach out to me directly or to Tevora. There's my contact information. If I don't respond to you directly, someone on my team will. If you want a copy of this deck, reach out to us and we'll provide you a copy. And again, this webinar will be posted on Tevora's website. So if you want to defer it to somebody within your organization or a fellow colleague in the industry, please do so. We would appreciate it. Upcoming webinars on June 2nd, data mapping, June 11th, creating an end-to-end cloud security strategy, June 16th, cloud ID management for Azure, June 13th, ISO 27001, July 14th, trust managing third-party risk, July 28th, privacy and risk in healthcare space, and August 11th, data mapping PCI 5.0. So you can see and I think that these webinars just kind of speak to the robustness, and we covered a lot more topics than this over the annual year, the calendar year. But this is just through August 11th. We have a lot of great webinars and a lot of really talented folks that you guys can learn from. So stay tuned into that webinar schedule. And that's it. There's our phone number. In addition, I'll leave on my contact information here as well. Just reach out to us. If you haven't worked with Tevora, we'd love to work with you in the near future and get a dialogue going. If you have worked up with us, thank you for attending, and we look forward to a continued strong relationship. Thanks, everyone.